So I work mostly in behavioral science. So I have a degree in biology, but I also have a degree in public health, and I work mostly with trying to develop ways for people to improve their health. And around 10 years ago, there was this belief that we were gonna, we being humanity, I guess, was gonna find that genetics were the answer to everything. So we would know what kind of diseases you or me or anybody was going to get based on our genetic makeup, and that genetics were going to be the answer to everything. And and as it's progressed, it's turned out that um, genetics are important, but um, the that our behavior and our environment is at least equally important. So two people with the same genetic makeup could have completely different outcomes because they're exposed to different things. So it's not just the genes; it's also um, what what you eat is going to interact with those genes, and the air you breathe, and behaviors that you decide to do. So it's but you know, your genes are passed on from generation to generation. So your mom and your dad's DNA intermingled, and it made you, right?
Hmm.
So our, you know, for, well, since, you know, probably since DNA was discovered, I think in the 50s, 1950s, um, that became, you know, pretty much firmly established that what, you know, your genetic makeup is a function of your two parents' genes. Well, now we're finding out that there can be environmental influences that turn genes on and off, and that can be passed on from generation to generation also. So it's not just as simple as the amino acids that make up the DNA, it's also the exposures that the DNA has had. So you even so you I guess that you could have two people with the exact same DNA, but the DNA could be turned on more because of maybe the kind of diet you had, or and that can be passed on down from generation to generation as well. Um, so you know, we never know what's going to be around the corner. We think we're starting to get something figured out, but then there's some new twist on what we thought we knew. When we think we're getting closer to something, it just opens up a whole new area of thinking about um, of that thing, and how it relates to everything else. I think the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. But I don't think it increases. I don't think, in a real sense, it increases the amount we don't know. It just makes us more aware of what we don't know. So the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. But is there ever a sort of a finite amount of knowledge, or a finite amount of information in the universe? Um, I think there, I guess I kind of think there is probably a finite amount of information, but we'll never get close to it because our awareness of the amount of information keeps growing. But there's all these other aspects to it that we're still learning about, and each new aspect we learn about will generate more new aspects that we didn't know. And it's not that the amount of factual or information in the universe is changing. It's that we have an expanding awareness of the amount of information. The other thing that I've noticed is you can set up some sort of an experiment, and you have it set up so you think you're going to get a definite answer. It's going to be this way or that way, and but when you set up when you run the experiment, you get some answer that's in between that doesn't really definitive, which I think is just because we haven't defined all the variables. So if we think a certain thing causes a certain outcome, and so we do that thing and we get a different outcome, we it's because there's more variables involved in what we thought was a simple cause and effect relationship. So we have about 800 kids that are in a study, and each year we do a skin exam of those kids to see to look at the number of moles that they have, and from birth to I don't know, sometime in the late teen years, a person gets most of the moles that they're going to get over their lifetime. They might get a few more after that, but they get most of them during that time. And that's one of the major risk factors for melanoma. And it's also, they're induced, or well, you develop them it's partly genetic and partly environmental. So if you have a lot of sun exposure, you generally would get more moles than you would if you had less sun exposure. Some people get a lot of moles, some people don't get any moles. But the two big components are genetics and sun exposure. And the more moles you get, the more risk you have for melanoma. So we've been following these kids over time to look at the factors that influence their mole development. And we do surveys each year with their parents to find out how much sun exposure the kids are getting. And then we have taken DNA samples to look at specific genes that we think might be related to melanoma. And then we also collect information about whether they use sunscreen and whether they wear a hat and things like that, whether they purposely tan. So as we're doing that, the whole field becomes more confusing because you expect sort of simple relationships, like if you have a certain gene and you get more sun exposure, then you're going to have more moles, but then you find that there's certain subgroups of people that applies to and others that it doesn't apply to. And I guess that's how it relates back to this whole question of expanding knowledge and expanding ignorance. Is the more you find out, the less you understand it. And there's only a few other studies that have looked at these kind of things, and some of our results are different than there's a study done in Australia, and some of our results are different than what they found in Australia. But it may be because in Australia, that's like the sunniest, I guess, continent in the world. Well, I don't know if it's actually the sunniest continent, but they have the highest skin cancer rates in the world in Australia. So it could be that it's because of the different climate and sun exposure and genetic makeup of people in Australia that they're going to get. So things just more complicated the more you look at them.